About 10 years ago, martial arts was outlawed in Russia.
On a cold night in 1988, Chuck Norris sat alone in a limousine outside a Los Angeles premiere, while fans chanted his name like a war cry. His body was a weapon feared across continents. His films had grossed hundreds of millions. But inside that car, the most dangerous man in Hollywood pressed his forehead against the glass and fought back tears. Because beneath the legend, a barefoot boy from Oklahoma was still trembling, still stammering, still waiting for a father who would never come home. There is an irony in Chuck Norris's story that hurts too much to be coincidence. The child who could not speak a single sentence without his tongue betraying him, whose words crumbled like dry earth before they reached the air. The teenager who discovered that fists could speak with a fluency his mouth never achieved. The icon who built an entire empire on the myth of invincibility, who became the living proof that a real man never bleeds, never bends, never breaks. All of that, so that time would arrive decades later and begin dismantling exactly that myth, forcing him to kneel before the one opponent no roundhouse kick could ever reach. How does a stammering, invisible boy from a town the world forgot become the most iconic martial artist in American history? What was the true cost of building an identity on the ruins of a childhood no one should survive? And what happens when the man who convinced millions that strength means never falling discovers that his body, his marriages, and his very sense of self are quietly crumbling beneath the legend he created? To understand all of that, we need to go back to a forgotten town called Ryan in the red dust plains of southern Oklahoma to March 10, 1940, and to a boy who learned, in the cruelest way possible, that love and violence could wear the same face. Carlos Ray Norris was born into a world that had no use for him. Ryan, Oklahoma was a place where the sky pressed down like a gray lid on a rusted pot, where the wind carried nothing but dust and the scent of cattle, and where ambition was considered a dangerous kind of madness. His father, Ray Norris, drove trucks and fixed engines when sobriety allowed, a man whose rare tenderness existed only in the brief hours before the drinking began. His mother, Wilma Scarberry Norris, carried Cherokee and Irish blood in her veins, a woman whose spine was forged from generations of survival and whose quiet faith held the family together when nothing else could. There was no luxury in the Norris home, no bedtime stories, no safety. The family drifted from town to town, chasing work that always promised more than it delivered, living in houses where the walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every shattered bottle, every silence that followed. But poverty was not the wound that cut deepest into young Carlos. That wound smelled like whiskey and arrived without warning. Ray Norris drank with the dedication other men reserved for prayer. And when the alcohol took hold, the father vanished, and something else surfaced. Something unpredictable and dark. Something with heavy hands and a voice like gravel scraping bone. The home became a place where tenderness and terror shared the same hallways. The boy learned to read danger the way other children read picture books. The creak of a floorboard after midnight. The weight of a stumbling footstep down the hallway. The quality of silence that always preceded the explosion. He mapped his father's moods with the precision of a child whose survival depended on becoming invisible at exactly the right moment. Because a single miscalculation meant bruises he would have to explain at school the next morning. And school offered no refuge. Carlos carried a stammer that turned every spoken word into a public execution of his dignity. His tongue locked against the roof of his mouth like a rusted gate, trapping sentences that formed perfectly in his mind but emerged broken, stuttering, pathetic. The other children laughed with the surgical cruelty that only the young truly possess. They mimicked his stammer in the hallways between classes. They called him names that carved into his memory like initials scratched into prison walls. He was not Carlos to them. He was the stammering kid. The quiet one. The boy you could push and push and push, knowing he would never push back. The permanent, inescapable target. He learned early that silence was safer than ridicule, that invisibility was not weakness, but the only form of survival available to him. He built walls from shame and reinforced them with the certainty that he was born fundamentally defective, that the world was right to overlook him and always would be. Years later, he would confess with devastating honesty, "I was the shyest kid in the world. I had a terrible inferiority complex. I truly believed I was inferior to everyone around me. These words, spoken by a man the world would worship as the embodiment of fearlessness, reveal the shattering distance between the myth and the broken child who created it. At 12, the final blow arrived. Not a fist this time, but an absence. Ray Norris walked out forever, abandoning Wilma and 3 young sons with the indifference of a man discarding something he never valued. No money, no explanation, no forwarding address. Just a house swollen with silence, and a boy standing in a doorway, watching dust settle behind a truck that would never return. Wilma took on multiple jobs to keep food on the table, working to the edge of collapse with a determination her eldest son would absorb and carry for life. For most children, this abandonment would have ended everything. For Carlos, it was about to become the most painful redirection imaginable. The years that followed his father's departure were a slow education in endurance. Wilma Norris moved the family to Prairie Village, Kansas, then later to Torrance, California, chasing the promise of steadier work and a life that did not taste like dust and disappointment. Young Carlos arrived in California as a ghost, a thin boy with downcast eyes and pockets full of nothing, carrying the invisible weight of everything his father had broken. High school in Torrance was not the fresh start his mother had prayed for. Carlos remained withdrawn, average in academics, unremarkable in every measurable way. He was the kind of student teachers forgot by the end of the semester, the kind of boy whose yearbook photo would someday puzzle classmates who could not recall his face. He joined no teams. He led no clubs. He moved through hallways like smoke, desperate to avoid attention, because attention, in his experience, always preceded pain. But something was beginning to shift beneath the surface, a tectonic movement invisible to everyone, including Carlos himself. The anger that his father had planted in him was growing roots, searching for an outlet that was not destruction. He graduated from high school in 1958 without distinction, without direction, and without a single clue about what his life was supposed to become. The military seemed like the only door that would open for a boy with no money, no connections, and no particular talent anyone had ever noticed. At 18, Carlos Ray Norris enlisted in the United States Air Force and was stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea. He arrived in a foreign country carrying the same silence that had protected him through childhood, the same stammer that still ambushed him in conversation, the same belief that he was fundamentally less than everyone around him. Korea was cold, alien, and lonely. Most young airmen spent their free hours drinking or playing cards, killing time until their service ended. But one afternoon, something happened that would alter the entire trajectory of his existence. Carlos wandered past the base gymnasium and saw Korean martial artists training in Tang So-do. The movements were violent and beautiful simultaneously, precise as surgery and explosive as detonation. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching bodies become weapons with a discipline that bordered on spiritual devotion.
Most of the martial artists you meet are the humblest, nicest people you'll meet.
And when he stepped onto the mat for the first time, when his bare feet pressed against the canvas and his fists rose into position, something extraordinary happened. The stammer did not matter. The shyness evaporated. The invisible boy from Oklahoma discovered that combat was a language spoken entirely by the body, a language in which his broken voice was irrelevant. On that mat, he was not the stammering kid. He was not the abandoned son. He was not invisible. He was dangerous. And for the first time in his life, that felt like freedom. It was not talent yet. It was recognition. The silent, absolute certainty of having found the place where his damage could be transformed into something powerful. Only Chuck Norris was free when his fists were moving. Only in the precise geometry of combat did the noise in his head finally go quiet. He trained with a devotion that frightened his fellow airmen. While others slept, Carlos practiced kicks against wooden posts until his shins bled. While others wrote letters home, he memorized forms until his muscles burned with a fire that felt infinitely preferable to the cold emptiness that had defined his childhood. He earned his black belt in Tang So-do before leaving Korea, and when he returned to California in 1962, he was no longer the same boy who had left. But California did not care about transformation. California in the early 1960s was not kind to dreams built on martial arts, a discipline most Americans associated with cheap Saturday afternoon kung fu movies or exotic Oriental mystery. There was no career path. There was no money. There was no industry waiting to embrace a 22-year-old airman with a black belt and a stammer. Carlos took a job at Northrop Aviation, working on aircraft assembly lines, fitting pieces of metal together, while his mind drifted to roundhouse kicks and spinning back fists. He opened a small martial arts studio in Torrance, with borrowed money and second-hand equipment, teaching students in a space that smelled like sweat and rubber mats and quiet desperation. The studio barely survived. Month after month, he counted coins on the kitchen table, stretching every dollar until it screamed. He taught classes during the day, worked odd jobs during the evening, and trained alone at night in an empty studio where the fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects. His wife Deanne, whom he had married in 1958, watched her husband pour everything into a dream that produced nothing resembling financial security. Rejection was constant and casual. Other martial artists dismissed his style. Business advisors told him to find a real career. Friends from the Air Force had already settled into stable jobs with pensions and predictable futures. The world was essentially unanimous in its assessment that Carlos Norris was wasting his life on a fantasy. There were moments when Torrance felt not like an opportunity, but like a beautifully decorated trap. A place where dreams were permitted to exist just long enough to make their death truly painful. He would lie awake at night listening to Deanne's breathing, staring at the ceiling, wondering if his father had been right about him all along. If the stammering boy was the real Carlos, and the martial artist was just a costume he wore to hide from a truth he could not face. But every morning, he got up. Every morning, he opened the studio. Every morning, he chose the mat over the assembly line, the dream over the certainty, the fight over the surrender. Because Carlos Norris had spent his entire childhood learning one lesson above all others. When everything falls apart, you do not stop moving. You cannot afford to.
Shooting as much as I can and using my martial arts ability that Walker has.
Breakthrough did not arrive with trumpets or applause. It arrived in a karate tournament in 1964, inside a gymnasium that smelled like floor polish and adrenaline, where Carlos Ray Norris fought with a ferocity that made spectators lean back in their seats. He did not win that tournament. But he fought with something the judges had never seen before. A controlled fury that suggested this man was not competing for trophies, but for his very right to exist. He began entering every tournament he could find, traveling across California with gas money he could barely afford, sleeping in his car when motels were too expensive, eating meals that consisted of whatever was cheapest and most portable. Between 1964 and 1968, something remarkable began to happen. The stammering boy who could not speak started winning. Not occasionally, not luckily, dominantly. He won the professional middleweight karate champion title and held it for an extraordinary 6 consecutive years, retiring undefeated in 1974. 6 years without a single loss. The boy who had never won anything in his life suddenly could not be beaten by anyone alive. The name Carlos disappeared during this period, replaced by the name a fellow airman had given him years earlier in Korea. Chuck. Simple, sharp, American. A name that hit like a jab. Chuck Norris became a name that martial artists spoke with reverence and opponents heard with dread. But more importantly, the tournaments introduced him to someone who would change absolutely everything. In 1968, at a karate demonstration, Chuck met Steve McQueen, the biggest movie star in the world. McQueen was studying martial arts and recognized in Chuck something beyond technique, a screen presence that radiated from the quiet man like heat from sun-baked stone. McQueen looked at Chuck with the certainty of someone who understood fame from the inside and said words that detonated like a grenade in the martial artist's carefully constructed worldview. He told Chuck he should try acting. The suggestion was absurd. Chuck Norris could barely order coffee without his stammer ambushing him. The idea of standing before cameras and delivering dialogue was terrifying, laughable, impossible. But Steve McQueen did not merely suggest. He insisted. He connected Chuck with acting coaches and industry contacts, opening doors that would have remained permanently sealed for a man with no Hollywood connections. Chuck enrolled in acting classes where he sat among students half his age, stumbling through dialogue exercises with the desperate awkwardness of a man fighting his deepest fear. His early performances were stiff, wooden, painful to watch. Instructors pulled him aside and gently suggested he might want to consider a different career path. But Chuck had spent his entire life being told he was not enough. The criticism did not destroy him. It fueled him. He approached acting the way he approached martial arts, with the relentless repetition of a man who believed that discipline could compensate for any deficiency. He practiced lines in front of mirrors until his jaw ached. He recorded his own voice and listened back, cringing at the stiffness, but forcing himself to try again. Then again, then again. His first significant film role arrived in 1972, playing a villain opposite Bruce Lee in Return of the Dragon. Their fight scene in the Roman Colosseum became one of the most iconic martial arts sequences ever filmed. Chuck Norris lost the fight on screen, but won something far more valuable in reality. The world saw his face for the first time, and the world remembered it. But Hollywood did not rush to embrace. After Return of the Dragon, the phone did not ring with offers. Studios saw a martial artist, not an actor. They saw a man whose fighting was extraordinary, but whose emotional range seemed limited to variations of stoic silence. The rejection was polite but absolute. Casting directors smiled, shook his hand, and never called back. Chuck returned to his martial arts studios, teaching classes, training students, wondering if the glimpse of cinematic possibility had been nothing more than a beautiful accident that would never repeat itself. For 3 years he existed in a painful limbo between two worlds, too famous from tournaments to be anonymous, but too unknown in Hollywood to be employable. Then in 1977, everything shifted. Chuck starred in Breaker Breaker, a low-budget action film that was critically demolished but commercially successful enough to prove something the studios had been reluctant to believe. Audiences wanted to watch Chuck Norris fight on screen. They did not care about acting range or dramatic nuance. They wanted the real thing. A genuine fighter whose punches carried the weight of authenticity that no trained actor could replicate. The films came steadily after that. Good Guys Wear Black in 1978. A Force of One in 1979. The Octagon in 1980. Each one more successful than the last. Each one building the legend of a man who could not be stopped, could not be hurt, could not be defeated. The budgets grew. The audiences multiplied. Chuck Norris was becoming something larger than a movie star. He was becoming a myth. But here is what nobody understood then, what perhaps even Chuck himself could not yet articulate. Every character he played was the same character. The quiet loner who fights against impossible odds. The man who absorbs punishment without complaint. The warrior who never shows weakness because weakness, in his childhood vocabulary, meant destruction. Chuck was not acting. He was performing his own survival strategy on camera, transforming the coping mechanisms of a traumatized child into a cinematic identity that millions would worship. The stammering boy had found a voice at last. But that voice belonged to characters who never stammered, never trembled, and never admitted they were afraid. The mask fit so perfectly that even Chuck began to forget it was a mask at all. By 1983, Chuck Norris was no longer a man. He was a franchise. Lone Wolf McQuade arrived that year like a declaration of war against subtlety. And audiences loved every frame of it. Then came Missing in Action in 1984. A film that tapped into the unhealed wound of the Vietnam War with the precision of a fighter who understood exactly where to strike. The film grossed over $100 million worldwide against a modest budget, and suddenly, Chuck Norris was not just an action star. He was a cultural symbol, the embodiment of American toughness, at a moment when the nation desperately needed to believe in its own strength. The numbers were staggering. Between 1984 and 1990, Chuck Norris films generated hundreds of millions in combined global revenue. Code of Silence. The Delta Force. Firewalker. Missing in Action 2. Each title added another layer to the mythology. Studios that had once refused to return his calls now sent limousines to his door. The boy from Ryan, Oklahoma, who could not afford gas money to drive to karate tournaments, now commanded millions per film. And then television amplified the legend beyond anything cinema could achieve. Walker, Texas Ranger premiered on CBS in April 1993, and for the next 8 seasons, Chuck Norris entered American living rooms every week as Cordell Walker, a modern-day cowboy who dispensed justice with roundhouse kicks and a moral compass that never wavered. The show attracted over 12 million viewers per episode at its peak. It ran for 203 episodes, making Chuck one of the most recognized faces on the planet. The child who was invisible had become inescapable. The stammering boy whose words crumbled before reaching the air now had a voice that echoed across continents. The abandoned son, whose father had walked away without looking back, was now the symbolic father of an entire generation that believed in simple justice and unstoppable will. But behind the red carpets and million-dollar contracts, behind the legend and the catchphrases and the mythology, something was beginning to crack. Something had been cracking for years, and Chuck had simply refused to hear the sound, because hearing it would mean admitting that the mask was not his real face. His marriage to Deanne Holchek, the woman who had stood beside him through poverty and obscurity, was collapsing under the weight of fame. They had married in 1958, when Chuck was an 18-year-old airman with nothing but a duffel bag and a dream. She had believed in him when belief required extraordinary faith. She had counted coins with him, waited for him during tournaments, raised their two sons Mike and Eric, while Chuck chased a future that kept retreating toward the horizon. But fame is a corrosive substance that dissolves the very bonds it claims to celebrate. The filming schedules that stretched for months, the premieres in cities whose names blurred together, the constant presence of people who wanted something from Chuck Norris, the legend, while Deanne needed something from Carlos, the husband. The distance between them grew with the quiet persistence of a crack spreading through glass, invisible until the moment everything shatters. In 1988, after 30 years of marriage, Deanne filed for divorce. 30 years. The number itself carries a weight that statistics cannot measure. 3 decades of shared meals, shared beds, shared silences, shared dreams, dissolved into legal documents and divided assets. The news traveled through tabloids with the characteristic coldness of entertainment media. Another Hollywood marriage consumed by the machinery of fame. But for Chuck, the divorce was not a headline. It was a mirror. He looked into it and saw his father staring back, a man who had failed the people who needed him most. The parallel was devastating, undeniable, and it struck him with a force that no opponent had ever managed to generate. He had spent his entire adult life building the opposite of his father's legacy, constructing an image of reliability, strength, and moral certainty. And now, in the wreckage of his marriage, he confronted the possibility that the construction had been an illusion all along. Years later, he would admit with raw vulnerability that the divorce nearly destroyed him. Not financially, not professionally, but spiritually. The man who had taught the world that real men never quit had to sit with the knowledge that his marriage had ended, that his sons had watched their family disintegrate, that the cycle he had sworn to break had bent just enough to draw blood. During this period, Chuck also confronted a secret that the tabloids would eventually uncover with merciless enthusiasm. In 1991, he publicly acknowledged Dina, a daughter born from an extramarital affair that had occurred years earlier. The revelation was a grenade thrown into the carefully constructed fortress of his public image. The man who played moral heroes, who championed family values, who built his brand on unwavering righteousness, had to stand before the world and admit to a failure that no martial arts skill could defend against. The physical toll was mounting simultaneously with brutal indifference to his legendary status. Decades of competitive fighting and performing his own stunts had transformed his body into a landscape of accumulated damage. Herniated discs compressed nerves in his spine like vice grips. His shoulders carried torn ligaments that surgeons had repaired and re-repaired until the surgical scars layered over each other like geological strata. His knees, those hinges upon which his entire fighting career had pivoted, ground bone against bone with every step. The man whose body had been his instrument, his weapon, his identity, and his livelihood was slowly being betrayed by the very vehicle that had carried him to immortality. And unlike a film villain, time did not pause for dramatic effect before delivering its punishment. The 1990s should have been a victory lap. Walker, Texas Ranger dominated ratings. Chuck Norris merchandise lined store shelves. His face appeared on lunchboxes, posters, and t-shirts worn by children who would grow up believing that justice always arrived in the form of a perfectly executed roundhouse kick. But inside the legend, the man was fighting battles no audience would ever see. In 1998, Chuck married Gina O'Kelly, a former model 23 years his junior, whom he had met at a celebrity event in Dallas. The connection was immediate and intense, and for Chuck, it represented something he had believed was no longer possible: a second chance. An opportunity to build what his first marriage had failed to sustain. They married with the kind of hope that only those who have experienced profound loss can truly understand. The desperate, luminous hope of someone who knows exactly how much they have to lose. For years, the marriage flourished. Gina gave birth to twins, Dakota and Danielle, in 2001, and Chuck threw himself into fatherhood with the determination of a man trying to rewrite his own childhood. He was present in ways his father had never been. He changed diapers, attended school plays, coached sports teams, and performed all the mundane sacred rituals of parenthood that his own father had abandoned. But fate, it seems, had not finished testing Chuck Norris. In 2013, Gina underwent 3 MRI scans over an 8-day period, each one requiring contrast dye injections. What followed was a nightmare that would consume years of their lives and challenge everything Chuck believed about strength, willpower, and the limits of human endurance. Gina developed gadolinium toxicity, a rare and devastating condition caused by the heavy metal contrast agent used in MRI procedures. The symptoms were relentless and terrifying, burning sensations that radiated through her body like electrical fire, kidney damage that threatened organ failure, cognitive impairment that stole words from her vocabulary and memories from her mind, pain that medication could not touch, that doctors could not explain, and that the medical establishment initially refused to acknowledge even existed. Chuck watched his wife suffer, and something inside him shattered. Here was a man who had defeated every human opponent placed before him, a man who had built an empire on the mythology of invincibility, a man whose fictional characters saved victims every week with decisive violence and unwavering confidence. But there was no villain to fight here. There was no enemy whose defeat would restore justice. There was only his wife, crying in the darkness, and a medical system that seemed indifferent to her pain. They spent an estimated $2 million on treatment and experimental therapies, traveling the world in search of answers that conventional medicine refused to provide. Chuck stepped away from his career almost entirely, abandoning projects, canceling appearances, and disappearing from public life to become Gina's full-time caregiver and advocate. The legend retreated into the shadows while the man did the only thing he knew how to do. He fought. But this fight looked nothing like the ones that had made him famous. This fight happened in hospital waiting rooms where the fluorescent lights hummed with institutional indifference. This fight happened in midnight conversations with specialists who offered theories but no cures. This fight happened in moments when Gina looked at him with eyes that begged for relief he could not provide. And Chuck had to find words that would sustain hope when hope seemed like a cruel joke. The irony was devastating and precise. The man whose body had been indestructible on screen watched helplessly as his wife's body betrayed her. The warrior who had never shown weakness had to learn that vulnerability was not failure, but the precondition for genuine love. The legend built on the denial of pain had to sit with pain that could not be denied, defeated, or escaped through sheer willpower. They filed a lawsuit against the pharmaceutical companies in 2017, seeking over $10 million in damages and demanding accountability for what they believed was corporate negligence. The legal battle dragged through courts while Gina continued her slow, agonizing recovery. Chuck spoke publicly about the experience, his famous stoicism cracking just enough to reveal the desperation underneath. He told interviewers that watching his wife suffer was the hardest thing he had ever endured. Harder than his childhood. Harder than the poverty. Harder than 30 years of physical punishment in tournaments and film sets. Because in all those previous battles, he could fight back. He could throw a punch, execute a kick, impose his will upon circumstance through the sheer force of disciplined action. But against this enemy, action meant nothing. Will meant nothing. His legendary toughness was irrelevant. And yet, they survived. Gina slowly improved through alternative treatments and relentless care. The marriage did not just endure, but deepened into something stronger than either of them had previously experienced. Chuck discovered that the vulnerability he had spent his entire life fleeing was actually the doorway to a different kind of strength. A strength that did not require invincibility. A strength that could coexist with helplessness, with tears, with the admission that some battles cannot be won alone. The stammering boy who had built an empire on never showing weakness finally understood that weakness shown is not weakness at all. It is the radical courage of a human being who refuses to hide behind masks even when the world has rewarded those masks with fortune and fame. But the question remained, hovering over everything like Oklahoma dust. What does a legend do when the legend is no longer enough? What does Chuck Norris become when Chuck Norris the myth can no longer protect Chuck Norris the man? Today, at 85 years old, Chuck Norris lives on a ranch in Navasota, Texas, surrounded by the quiet rhythms of land and family that his childhood never provided. His body carries the accumulated testimony of 6 decades of combat. Spinal surgeries have left scars that trace his vertebrae like a roadmap of sacrifice. His knees protest every staircase. His shoulders remember every punch thrown and every fall absorbed. Every step reminds him of the price he paid for immortality on screen. The cost was not merely physical. One marriage dissolved after 30 years. A secret daughter revealed to the world. Years of his life surrendered to his wife's medical crisis. The mythology of invincibility dismantled piece by piece until only the man remained, standing in the rubble of his own legend, discovering that the rubble was actually foundation. He still trains, though the sessions are gentler now, the kicks lower, the movements slower. He still appears occasionally in films and television, his face weathered into something more interesting than his younger handsomeness ever achieved. The internet transformed him into a meme, an absurdist celebration of exaggerated masculinity that Chuck himself has embraced with surprising humor. Chuck Norris jokes circulate endlessly online, and the man at the center of the mythology laughs along, understanding perhaps better than anyone the distance between the legend and the truth. But here is what matters more than the jokes, the films, or the championship titles gathering dust in display cases. Chuck Norris survived. Not just physically, though that alone would be remarkable. He survived the childhood that should have destroyed him. He survived the poverty that should have limited him. He survived the stammer that should have silenced him. He survived the abandonment that should have taught him that love was unreliable. He survived the fame that should have consumed him. He survived the failures that should have defined him, and in surviving, he discovered something the mythology never captured. Real strength is not the absence of weakness. Real strength is the willingness to be weak, to fail, to fall, and to rise again, knowing that falling is inevitable. The roundhouse kick was never the point. The getting up was always the point. From the stammering boy hiding from his father's drunken rage to the icon whose name became synonymous with invincibility, his legacy is not the films or the championships or the cultural phenomenon of his image. His legacy is the living proof that the wounds we carry do not disqualify us from greatness. They are the very material from which greatness is forged. What lesson do you take from Chuck Norris's story? How many times have you risen when the world expected you to stay down? How many times have you built strength from the exact place where you were broken? Share your reflections below and subscribe for more stories of those who transformed their deepest scars into legends that illuminate the path for everyone still fighting in the darkness. Because in the end, as the stammering boy from Oklahoma taught us through 85 years of relentless survival, the measure of a person is not whether they fall. Everyone falls. The measure is whether they get up, and then get up again, and keep getting up until getting up becomes the only response to falling that makes any sense at all. That is not a legend. That is something far more valuable. That is a life.